Hey guys, so today we're going to be going over the second of the biogeochemical cycles. This one is the nitrogen cycle. So with the nitrogen cycle, just like the previous cycle that we looked at, we're going to be going over the different processes. You do have to be able to identify the processes by a description of the process or on a diagram of the different processes. There are only 6 main processes in the nitrogen cycle, but the names are a little trickier than the ones that we looked at in the carbon cycle. And then once again, we're also going to look at the human impact. So the nitrogen cycle is just all the different processes where nitrogen is converted between its different chemical forms, like nitrogen gas, nitrates, and nitrites. Most of Earth's atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, but atmospheric nitrogen is not available for biological use. What that means is that nitrogen that's in the atmosphere has to be converted into a different form before it can be incorporated into living things. Nitrogen availability does affect the rate of a whole bunch of different processes that take place in an ecosystem, such as things like the decomposition rates, as well as production of plants and stuff like that. All living things do need nitrogen to survive. All of our amino acids, which are the molecules that build our proteins, are made of nitrogen, among other compounds. Also, the nitrogenous bases, which are the building blocks for your DNA, also, as the name suggests, have nitrogen in them. So these are the 6 different parts of the nitrogen cycle: nitrogen fixation, assimilation, denitrification, ammonification, decay, and nitrification. These other images that you see on the screen here are not things that you have to memorize. These are just some different examples of the nitrogenous bases in your DNA. And as you can see, there's lots of nitrogen in them. And then this is a structure of an amino acid, which again is the building blocks for your proteins. Okay, so the first process that we're going to be looking at is nitrogen fixation. This is when nitrogen gas in the atmosphere is converted into nitrates, which are found in the soil. These nitrates can then be used in plants because they are biologically available, unlike nitrogen gas. And there are 2 different ways that nitrogen fixation happens. One is by lightning. Essentially, the energy of the lightning causes the nitrogen gas in the surrounding air to react with oxygen gas to make nitrates. The nitrates then dissolve in rain or any water on the surface of the earth and then move into the soil from there. The second way that nitrogen is fixed is using nitrogen fixing bacteria. This is actually the main way that nitrogen gas gets converted into nitrates. Essentially, these are bacteria that are found in the soil and little nodules in the roots of legumes. And these bacteria are able to convert nitrogen gas into nitrates directly. So plants like alfalfa, clover, peas, and soybeans are all really good things to plant if your soil is low on nitrogen. So for example, if you had other crops planted there for a couple of years, those crops would have removed the nitrogen from the soil. And so to put nitrogen back into the soil, you might plant one of these legumes in order to make your soil higher quality. The second process is assimilation. We briefly touched on assimilation in the previous cycle. Assimilation always refers to the movement of some sort of compound from into a living thing. So either from soil into plants or from plants into animals. So in the carbon cycle, we were talking about any time like a herbivore eats a plant, that is assimilation. But assimilation is also nitrogen moving from the soil into a plant, or when an animal eats that plant, nitrogen moving from the plant into the animal. Plant cells can use the nitrates to build DNA and amino acids. Amino acids are used to build proteins, and then when an animal consumes that plant and breaks down that plant, the protein in the plant is converted back into amino acids, which can then be used to build animal proteins instead. This also happens if an animal eats another animal. So pretty much any time a molecule is moving into a living thing, it is assimilation. The third process is denitrification. This is when the nitrates in the soil are converted back into nitrogen gas, which will go into the atmosphere. So denitrification is the opposite process to nitrogen fixation. And just like nitrogen fixation, it involves bacteria. In this case, we call them denitrifying bacteria. So what's going to happen is that these denitrifying bacteria, which are present in the soil, break down nitrates that are in the soil and then release them from the soil in the form of nitrogen gas. Yeah, I do love this cute little guy. I think of him every time I am picturing the process of denitrification. The next two processes, processes 4 and 5, are ammonification and decay. Ammonification happens whenever animals excrete waste or whenever plants die. As decomposers break down the animal waste or the dead plants, they release the organic nitrogen that was stored in that living thing into things like ammonia and ammonium. Why it's called ammonification, because we're making ammonia and ammonium out of other nitrogen products. And then decay is when a dead animal decomposes. Those decomposers convert the organic nitrogen directly into nitrites, which then get converted into nitrates, which are stored in the soil. And then the final process is nitrification. This process always follows ammonification. And essentially what's happening is that the ammonia or ammonium in the soil gets converted into nitrates, and then those nitrites get converted into nitrates. Those nitrates can then either be released back into the atmosphere as nitrogen gas by denitrifying bacteria, or can be assimilated back into plants. This process does always require oxygen because both nitrites and nitrates include oxygen, which you can see at the bottom here. They both have oxygens in them. So if there is no oxygen present, this won't happen and you will just have a buildup of ammonia or ammonium in your soil. So this is kind of the diagram that you need to be familiar with. Again, on a test or quiz, the diagram is not going to look exactly like this, but you do need to kind of recognize the main different parts. So we have the atmospheric nitrogen, or N2, that's our nitrogen gas up in the atmosphere. We have some nitrates in the soil. We also have some ammonium in the soil. This over here is lightning. This plant here would be one of our legumes, and it is kind of zooming in on the roots there to show you some of the nitrogen fixing bacteria. This little guy here is our denitrifying bacteria. Then we have some plants, animals, animal waste, and some dead plants and animals. So based on the descriptions that we just went over, pause here and see if you can figure out what the names of all of these different arrows are. There are more than one arrow for some of the names. Okay, so pause here and then come back to the answer. So this is how you should have labeled your diagram. Nitrogen fixation is when either lightning or the nitrogen fixing bacteria converts atmospheric nitrogen gas into nitrates in the soil. The opposite of that process is denitrification, where the nitrates in the soil are converted into atmospheric nitrogen. That is done by the denitrifying bacteria. Nitrates in the soil moving into plants or from plants into animals is assimilation. When animal waste or dead plants are broken down, the organic nitrogen is converted into ammonia in the process of ammonification. That ammonia is then converted into nitrates through the process of nitrification. Dead animals don't get converted into ammonium. They get converted directly into nitrates in the soil through the process of decay. Okay, so that is it for the actual processes of the nitrogen cycle. Next, we're going to look at some of the human impacts of the nitrogen cycle. The first is an impact by use of fertilization. So fertilizers are used by humans to grow crops as well as ornamental plants like in gardens and stuff like that. Fertilizers work by adding both nitrogen and phosphorus to the soil. So we're going to talk about this again when we go over the phosphorus cycle. But there are a couple issues with having too much nitrogen in the soil. The nitrogen gets converted into nitrates by bacteria in the soil, but the extra nitrates can react with water to produce nitric acid, which will increase the acidity or decrease the pH of the soil, which can harm organisms that live there, including both the microorganisms in the soil and the plants themselves. Nitrates can also be converted into nitrites, which can leach into water sources. And if you have too many nitrates or nitrites in the water, it essentially poisons any animals that drink that water. And that's because those nitrites actually bind with the hemoglobin in the blood of those animals, which reduces the ability of oxygen to circulate through those animals. Hemoglobin is the molecule in your blood that transports the oxygen around. So if that oxygen can't get transported because something else is binding to the hemoglobin, essentially the animals like kind of suffocate. Nitrogen in water sources can also lead to algal blooms, which are huge outbreaks of like massive growths in algae population. And that's an issue because when the algae dies, decomposers break it down, and that process of the decomposers breaking down the algae uses up a lot of oxygen, and it drops the oxygen levels in the lakes or whatever body of water we're talking about, which causes any aquatic life forms like fish to suffocate because there's not enough oxygen there for them. And we're going to talk about algal blooms in a couple of these other biogeochemical cycles as well. Even if you farm without the use of fertilizers, it does still have a large impact on the nitrogen cycle. If legumes are not planted regularly, the plants that you are planting, those crops, will take too much nitrogen out of the soil. And the reason this doesn't happen in nature is because, you know, in the wild, when plants take nitrogen out of the soil during their life, that plant then dies and those nitrates or nitrogen molecules go back into the soil. However, with like agriculture, if you're farming crops, those crops take nitrogen out of the soil and then you take those crops away. So there's no, you're missing the ammonification and nitrification part of the process of the nitrogen cycle since the plants aren't dying there and like breaking down there. So because of that, you tend to deplete the nitrogen resources in your soil. Obviously, the fix for that is to just plant some legumes, but not all farmers want to do that. That might not be where their source of income is. Burning fossil fuels also affects the nitrogen cycle. When you burn fossil fuels, it adds nitrogen to the biosphere, in this case, in the form of nitrates going up into the atmosphere. Nitrogen oxides also get released, which includes both nitrates and nitrites, which, by the way, you don't have to know the difference between, but they are just two slightly different nitrogen molecules. But those nitrates and nitrites go into the atmosphere, they react with water molecules in the atmosphere and form nitric acid, which then falls back to Earth in the form of acid rain. Acid rain will decrease soil pH, it can harm plants, microorganisms, it can harm fish if it's affecting bodies of water, that sort of thing. Okay, anyway, that is it for today's lesson. Of course, let me know if you have any questions.